My name is Jonathan Hall, so I work for a business called Kantar. If you don't know Kantar, we're the world's leading consumer and brand data analytics business. And I lead the sustainable transformation practice, which works at the intersection of people, brands, and social and environmental issues. And what I'm going to talk about today is bridging the value action gap. So that's the gap between people's stated values and beliefs and their actual behaviors and actions. The story is going to take 4 chapters. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the era of disruption that we're living in, the risks, but also the opportunities that come with that. I'm going to talk about some of the problems specific to the fashion sector. Then we're going to talk about, okay, how do we start to overcome those opportunities and create real connections with people as consumers? Okay, so let's go in. I've only got 15 minutes. There's a lot to cover. So at Kantar, we talk about how we're living in the era of disruption. So at the period from the mid-1980s to the financial crisis in 2008, economists call the Great Moderation. That is firmly in the past now. We're moving into a period of great uncertainty. All of the micro and macroeconomic data shows that. What we're looking at on the left-hand side of the chart here is the Global Economic Policy Uncertainty Index. So if you look from 2008, it started to go crazy. I stopped it at 2021. You can imagine what happened after that. It's fueled by climate change, so you'll be familiar with the Global Risks Report on the right-hand side from the World Economic Forum. The severity of risk over 2 and 10 years is what you're looking at. And what you see, those green dots right at the top of the chart, because those are the things which drive the greatest risk in the mind of experts. So we're going to see increased disruption. This is really, really important because all of the management tools and approaches that we've used since the Second World War were created in periods of greater stability. And we as businesses and brands are going to have to adapt to greater disruption. We're feeling pressure as businesses from all stakeholders. Stakeholders, employees, the financial community, government. We've heard all about regulation over the last couple of days. And also from consumers. So Kantar data here that you see, global data this is, 74% of people saying, I believe businesses have a responsibility to make society fairer. 64% saying it's businesses' responsibility to solve climate and environmental issues. This is especially true for younger cohorts, those that are going to define the marketplace in the future. 2 questions here. 1, I consider myself an environmentalist. 2nd, buying sustainable products or choosing environmental and socially conscious services shows others who I am and what I believe in. This is about social identity. What you see there is the 2 cohorts that pop are millennials and Gen Z, the future of human society. And it's particularly driven by the late millennials and being picked up by Gen Z. And we're going to talk more about that shortly. What does this all mean for companies? Well, this is what Mark Carney thinks, who is the UN Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance, the former governor of the Bank of England and Canada. He says, well, if some companies and industries fail to adjust to this new world, they will simply fail to exist. And it's picked up in the annual CEO survey of the UN Global Compact and Accenture, who say that basically for the world's largest companies, pretty much 100% of CEOs believe sustainability is critical to their future success. That makes it all sound about risk, but actually there's huge economic opportunity here as well, which is what I want to turn to. McKinsey and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development have both estimated separately an economic value of $12 trillion a year in sustainability. This is data from Kantar's Brand Z, which is the world's biggest brand valuation database. And what you see on the left-hand side there is an analysis of the sustainability contribution to brand value of the world's top 100 brands. Now, I would say that only 2 of those top 100 are actually overperforming on sustainability, and yet still the economic value is $193 billion. And then look at the 3rd column. So we also measure corporate reputation. Sustainability has been the most important driver of corporate reputation now for the last 5 years. It contributes 45% to corporate rep. So we're living in an era of disruption, massive risk, massive opportunity. But what about how we're going to realize that opportunity? Well, there are some problems. The first problem is the value action gap. So our data shows globally that 93% of people want to live a sustainable lifestyle, but only 10% of them are following through. You've all seen this sort of data before. Now, it's easy to think, well, people are just overclaiming or they're virtue signaling. And there's some of that, for sure. But the reality is that there are very clear behavioral barriers that people meet when they try to live a more sustainable lifestyle. We've heard some of them yesterday. It's to do with price, it's to do with convenience, accessibility, perceived performance, perceived quality. These are things which are very real and tangible, and people want help with. 88% of people saying, look, I want brands to help me be more sustainable. They're asking for it. However, there are some problems that we've got to deal with, and particularly as a sector. So this is Kantar's Sustainability Sector Index. We rank sectors from plus 100 to a minus 100. You'll see fresh fruit and vegetables on plus 100. You'll see tobacco and vaping at the bottom. And fashion is in the lowest tier here, and luxury is even worse. If you're from a luxury brand, you're behind oil and gas in terms of how people perceive you on your sustainability performance. It gets even worse because actually greenwashing is, as we all know, a huge thing. If you ask people, have you seen or heard false or misleading information about sustainable actions taken by brands? 52% of people across the world say they have. It's pretty true across all sectors, but again, in fashion and luxury, we're performing pretty badly. Now, this is complicated data, but very quickly, on the left-hand side, if you look at the horizontal axis, this is perceived greenwashing. On the vertical axis, this is people actively trying to get to know more about how they can reduce their impact. You see an almost perfect correlation. When people look for solutions, the more they think brands are greenwashing. If you look on the right-hand side, same horizontal axis, but the vertical axis is I've stopped buying products or services because of what I've found out. And this is really troubling for brands, because the more people become knowledgeable and look for solutions, the more they think brands are greenwashing and the more they stop buying your products. So we've got problems to do with the value action gap, to do with poor performance of the fashion sector, and also to do with greenwashing. So how do we start to address this? How do we start to create meaning with our consumers and those connections? There are two ways I want to talk about. First is responsibility, and second is inclusivity. So responsibility, how do we actually identify out of all of the SDGs, out of all of our ESG commitments, what's actually going to connect with our consumers? Well, if you ask a consumer which issues they think a brand should be active on, it will be different according to whether you're in retail financial services, you're in consumer tech, or you're in fashion. So what you're looking at here is sector relevance across the bottom, and you're looking at the importance of a concern across the top. So in terms of sectors, we want to be focusing on the things on the right-hand side. Bottom right is our defensive strategies, top right is our offensive strategies. So for fashion, and I've simplified things here, it's 2022 data, but our defensive plays are around overconsumption, waste, over-packaging. The offensive plays are around some hazardous waste, but also some of the supply chain issues and labour rights issues we've been hearing about. And some brands are already looking at this. So some of you in the room will be doing this already. There's some great initiatives from the French government and the Singaporean Heritage Board with organisations like Refashion and Recustom. You've got subscription models like Early Majority. You've got Petit Pli looking at kids' fashion waste, no-sew patches, the problems of tears with outdoor garments, and then things obviously more mainstream, Chloe Vertical on transparency and the instant resale, Bottega Veneta with their craft certificate, and Veja looking at their repair hub. There are great things we can learn from, and there'll be plenty of others as well. But what about inclusion? And this is the great missed opportunity, and this is true across any sector, because people tend to think that by appealing to diverse communities, it's actually more niche marketing. The opposite is true. So let's look at the economic value of some of those communities, and we call them underserved populations. Now, it's not the case in fashion, but certainly in other sectors, women are hugely underserved. They represent $43 trillion of global consumer spending. But let's look at other communities. LGBTQ+, $3.9 trillion of buying power. Disabled people, $8 trillion of buying power. These are communities which are right there, which we're not taking account of. I could go on. The reason this is important is that there's economic value locked up in those communities, but there are also values which are going to define society more broadly going forward. So we do a lot of work in generational theory, and what we're going through at the moment is only the second major pivot in the last 120 years. So if you look at the early to mid 20th century, it was defined by institutionalism. That started to crumble in the First World War and broke down after the Second World War. And the boomers led us out into a period of greater individualism. And brands that took advantage of that, typically you think of Levi's and Harley-Davidson and Marlboro, were the ones that won in the marketplace. Now we're going through a similar sort of change. It's being driven by late millennials and it's being picked up by Gen Z. It's a shift from individualism to a greater sense of mutualism. Now, it doesn't mean, of course, that individualism is going to disappear overnight. The Kardashians are going to be with us for a long time, unfortunately. But mutualism will be the defining values of the marketplace going forward. And those brands that focus on that will be the ones that win. What are the values of Gen Z and millennials? Well, if you look at the top line there, diversity and inclusion important to over 80% of those cohorts, and for over 40%, it always or often influences my buying decisions. And it's true also of the growing economies throughout the world, in APAC, in LATAM, in Africa, which of course are defined by Gen Z. So as the greater economic value locked up in those markets can be released. What does, old school look like? Well, this is an ad I just pulled off the web. It's got a family that's not diverse. You've got a mother that's unrealistic. She's too young. You've got pajamas that are expected color by gender. And you've got messages. There's a negative message on the female pajamas and a positive on the male's pajamas. This just looks tone deaf in our current society. And I want to talk about three things and give examples of some brands that are doing this well. So size inclusivity, gender neutrality, and culture positivity. So universal standard you'll all be familiar with, Maya probably as well, but look at that quote on the right-hand side. You don't know how many times I saw a group of friends walk in, and one girl, because she was considered plus size, had to separate from her friends and shop by herself. Gender neutral, we've seen Stella McCartney move into this space, but also a bunch of brands like Unrecorded, Wildfang, and Core. And then creating spaces for people who feel vulnerable when they move into commercial outlets and generally within society. So the Fluid Project in New York has created, yes, of course, a commercial space where they sell clothes, but also a juice bar and a coffee shop and places where events are held so people can go in and feel comfortable. And then the final point is around culture positivity. So you see again data here from Kantar across the world where you've got communities asking for respect. That's all they're asking for. And then if we look on the right-hand side, some examples, I'll pull out one. Victoria's Secret, where in a fashion shoot they used a Navajo war dress. And you can see the response there from the Navajo Nation spokesman saying, they're spitting on us. That's the way it feels to communities. You've got some great examples. I'll pick out one there, Osculin, the Brazilian brand, where the creative director went and visited the Amazonian tribe. He understood the aesthetic values. He gave a voice to their environmental concerns and then actually gave royalties back to the tribe. And then finally, modest fashion. Obviously, you've got brands already looking at this trend. It's expected to reach $428 billion by 2027. But the more important part is the quote on the right-hand side. Women from other religious cultures also want modest clothing, and many women who are secular or not religious also want ensembles that allow them to choose which parts of their body are on display. It's not just about Muslim women. And my final chart, just to finish off, is we did some work with the United Nations Unstereotype Alliance and the Oxford University. And it was looking at the economic value of inclusive marketing. And this was really in response to brands being worried about talking about inclusivity in their marketing, particularly in the United States. But what we found, we looked at inclusive advertising, and we looked at those advertisers who had more prominent inclusive messages. And we looked at over the short and long term, and we looked at brand and sales performance. And these are the numbers. 33% higher, stronger consideration, 62% higher likelihood of being first choice for consumers. If you go to the bottom level there, 54% higher pricing power and 15% higher loyalty. Look at the sales data, we had uplift both in sale in the short term and the longer term. So conclusive evidence that inclusive marketing has economic value. So that's it. We're living in an era of disruption. Consumers are really wanting to live more sustainable lifestyles. As brands, we're failing them. There's an opportunity for us in the sector, and we need to do that by creating meaning through responsibility and inclusivity. Thank you.
Jonathan, thank you so much.